Hello, YouTubers, friends, compatriots, bootlickers, shills, nestlights, stars, peasants, vassals, Google Plusers. I'm a useful idiot, at least as long as Google Plus allows me to call myself that. And today I want to talk about the reality that the United States is in a depression. And the United States has been in a depression since the economic crash of 2008. And this is along with the fact that the Eurozone has also been in a depression. And so we have a global depression going on. And I'm no economic expert, but I can look at the facts and be objective and use a little common sense and come to the conclusion that the United States is in a depression. And I think there's three major ways in which a depression can be disguised, and this is what we see going on now for the last 5 years. First major way that a depression can be disguised is by changing the formulas, adjusting the way you do measurements. The most obvious way is the unemployment numbers. We have a multi-level system of measuring unemployment, and if we used the same unemployment methodology that we used back in the Reagan administration, right now unemployment would be around 16%. And if you use other ways to measure unemployment going further back, you would come up with an unemployment number that's closer to somewhere between 20 and 25%, which seems to be more realistic when you have 100 million people dropping off the unemployment rolls completely. They are no longer considered unemployed. So if we use those same methods, the unemployment levels would certainly be approaching depression levels. And let's remember as well that the unemployment numbers certainly shifted. They weren't a constant 25 or percent during the Depression, which lasted from 1929 to 1941. So a long time. And just like now, a lot of things that occurred during the first Depression are repeating themselves now. But I'll cover more of that later. So anyway, the government, and as well as corporations, adjust all these formulas and ways to measure things, and they distorted inflation and taken energy and housing and food and things out of inflation. The consumer price index has been distorted and readjusted. Gross domestic product was recently adjusted to include all sorts of new factors, including research and development. So that's going to distort where the gross domestic product is right now, as well as the way they measure the GDP in general, and certainly economic growth, which is all distorted. But I'll also get to that more later. So we have this situation where if they don't like the results, they just change the formula until they get the results they want. It's kind of the same way the government never really changes its policies. They just hire a new public relations firm and try a new marketing technique, which is, of course, what we've seen with Obamacare. So then another way, major factor that has distorted the fact that we are in a depression is all the safety nets that we have now that didn't exist during the first Depression. And so we have not only these government subsidy programs and unemployment like and food stamps. Not only does it distort the numbers, the actual economic reality out there by keeping these people afloat, but also these safety nets disguise the physical reality of what a depression looks like. For example, we have near 50 million people on food stamps. Let's say even half of those, let's say 25 million of them were out in the streets in soup kitchens. Everybody would feel like we were in a depression. So we're not seeing those same repeat of those same images from the previous Depression, because now we have unemployment benefits, we have Section 8 housing, we have Social Security, we have disability, we have Medicare, we have Medicaid, all these different programs that didn't exist before. And the last way that major factor and method that is used to disguise the fact that we're in a depression is the biggest one, and that's central bank intervention and extraordinary measures. We're seeing things that couldn't even have been imagined 5 years ago. The Federal Reserve balance sheet up to $4 trillion, the ECB balance sheet $4 trillion, and speculation about them doubling it, and as well as the situation in Japan. So we have the central banks basically eliminating the free markets and price discovery and reinflating these asset bubbles. And so we have a situation, deflation, which would be natural in a depression. But rather than face the economic consequences, the central banks have all joined together to keep the entire system afloat. But it's all artificial. And so that's the biggest factor disguising the fact that we are in a depression. I will touch on more of that later as well. So let's get into different sectors of the economy and see how the depression's been disguised. So they talk about a recovery in the auto industry, but now we have a resurgence of massive amounts of subprime loans and giveaways in the auto industry, which disguises the fact that the auto industry is failing. We have massive purchases for government fleets, and so that reinflates the sales numbers for these failing auto companies. And then we also have all the subsidies, and that's all the guarantees for all these low subprime loans for all these people to buy auto industry because they're just desperate to keep the industry afloat and certainly keep the numbers afloat. And we see the same thing in real estate. In housing, we have most of the purchases going on out there are institutional investors. We have the hedge fund Blackstone, which is now the largest real estate holder in the United States and has bought over 200,000 houses, which helps reinflate those housing prices as well. They single-handedly have brought those prices up. And that also includes the fact that we have a lot of foreign buyers. In California, 1 out of every 10 homes sold there is sold to Chinese. And then on top of that, we have the shadow inventory. People that have been foreclosed on that are still living in their houses 1, 2, 3, and 4 years later. And the banks would prefer to do that rather than take the losses, write down the losses on their balance sheets. And then just like with the auto industry, we have government subsidies, and we have another subprime housing market that has developed, another housing bubble that's developed. And not only that, we still have mortgage-backed securities and asset-backed securities from auto loans going into the market. It's part of what the Federal Reserve is buying, continuing to buy mortgage-backed securities. And then commercial real estate, they just avoided a debacle by rolling over the debt terms, debt repayment terms. So that's kept commercial real estate looking better, at least on paper. And we look at the reality of all the major stores and retail outlets and malls that are closing all across the country. The latest being Blockbuster, going to close 300 stores. What business retail model is going to go into those spaces vacated by Blockbuster, and how is that going to affect other businesses around it? So more deflationary spirals there. And then, like I mentioned earlier, just adjusting all the numbers, the inflation numbers, consumer price index numbers, the gross domestic product numbers, the unemployment numbers. And then, obviously, at the heart of this, the banks. And so here it is, 5 years later, they're still getting all this zero interest money, free money from the Federal Reserve, and the banks just park at the Federal Reserve and get interest on it. And it just keeps pouring into the banks. And yet here it is 5 years later, and they're still on the government tit. So if it's a recovery and we're out of these so-called recessions, then why do the banks still have to get free money 5 years later? And any slight adjustment could topple the whole system. Doesn't sound like much of a recovery to me. And like the first depression, we had a lot of small banks that closed. And just because the scale wasn't quite as large as the depression, I don't think we can negate the fact that 1,400 small banks closed in the last 5 years, and that the too big to fail banks have an even larger portion of the market and are more dangerous. And their assets have grown by 70% in the last 5 years, the too big to fail banks. One of the things that people forgot about, too, is the banks were basically allowed to ignore a rule called mark-to-market back during the original crash, and they still haven't reversed this. And that would require banks to actually write down all the losses, what the values of their so-called assets really are. And of course, if they did that, like I've been saying all along, all the banks are broke. If they actually went back to mark-to-market rules, all the banks would be broke. And then last of all, in the economic sector, we have retail. And all the indicators are that retail will continue to suffer. Once again, we have a continuing shifts in the dynamics of the market. We have, like I say, Blockbuster going out of business. J.C. Penney's on its knees. A lot of these major retail outlets are really struggling. And all indicators about inventory buildups and the Baltic Dry Index and even FedEx and rail traffic all show quite a bit of slowdown in the retail industry. And so now let's get down to just a bunch of facts and figures that just show how tragic this situation that we're in. Once again, I say we have all this discussion of whether we're in a recession or not in a recession, and usually when we just find out that the United States is in a recession or even a depression, it's generally looking back. There's always a lot of talk at the time that it's debatable. Even during the last depression, we see a lot of repeat of the same events. These headlines from the 30s saying that all the massive recovery right around the corner, everything's looking up, the banks are doing great, blah, 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 and now we're seeing a repeat of that. Anybody can Google old headlines from the last depression and see the irrational exuberance, as Mr. Greenspan would say. So let's look at some of these harrowing numbers about the depression that the United States is in. And I've done other videos, a series of videos on the Eurozone depression with even more staggering figures in unemployment. So the Eurozone is definitely in a deep depression. So let's get down to the gruesome details. 1 out of every 10 jobs is filled by a temp agency. 40% of all workers make below $20,000 a year. 1 out of 4 Americans make less than $10 an hour. 56,000 manufacturing facilities lost in the last 10 years. In the United States, we only have 12 million people employed in manufacturing now. 58% of working age Americans have jobs. Only 58%. So we have a 64% labor participation rate in the job market, and an all-time record low. 100 million working age people have no jobs. The self-employed is at an all-time low, and that's an interesting point to talk about because in the last depression, over 70% of Americans were self-employed. A staggering number. Of course, a lot of that was because people lived in rural areas and ran family farms and the like. And then, of course, there was a lot of small businesses, a lot of entrepreneurship. The fact that whole trend is reversed, once again, it makes this depression that more devastating. Back then, you had 70% self-employed, no safety net, so pretty devastating. And like I brought up earlier, now it's disguised by all the safety nets. So the fact that we have so many self-employed people being economically devastated, but being disguised by the fact that we have so many safety nets. 20 million people spend half their income on housing. And of course, during this depression, with deflationary forces pushing housing prices down, the fact that 20 million people spend half their income on housing is having a devastating impact as the value of their houses went down. Mortgage delinquency rate nationally is 10%. And then we have $1 trillion in student loan debt. And that's another dynamic that's a lot different than the last depression. We have $1 trillion in student loan debt. Once again, all this debt is rolled into securities. So this could be another debacle if this continues to unwind. And we have a massive amount of people moving back in with their parents. In fact, 25 million adults living with their parents. And this is going to be a couple lost generations. And these youth are not only going to not have jobs that can even pay off their student loans, but they're not going into the real estate market. They're not buying cars. They're not getting married. They're not raising families. So that will be another impact of this depression when people look back and see it as the depression that it is. The average debt-to-income ratio of U.S. household is 154%. That's another huge difference between this depression and last depression. A lot of this depression is disguised because people can sustain their lifestyles and stay above the water by dipping into their pensions, their 401ks, their savings, and using credit, massive amount of credit. In fact, $13.7 trillion in household debt. So imagine that credit not available like it was in the last depression. $13.7 trillion is a great way to disguise a depression. A third of people's pay goes to state, local, and federal taxes. And so that's having a devastating effect as well. 46 million people in the United States living in poverty. 25 million adults living with their parents, as I mentioned earlier. 47 million on food stamps, as I mentioned earlier. Over 1 million public school students are homeless. This is painting a pretty stark picture of depression-like conditions. 146 million Americans are poor or low income. And that has to be certainly comparable, especially when you look at the level of the population number for the 1930s compared to now. 146 million poor and low income. Sounds like depression conditions to me. 56, and as I mentioned earlier, the being able to disguise the depression because of the entitlement programs and safety nets. We have 56 million people on Social Security now, 9 million people on disability, and so that's a great way to disguise a depression as well. So there we have it. In my layman's terms, I will go out on a limb and defy all the cheerleading out there, the media, the corporations, the banks, the government, all the stuff they're talking about. We've had a recession, and we've avoided a double-dip recession, and we avoided a depression by the measures taken in the economic crash of 2008. Well, it's all that's all smoke and mirrors. It's all lies. It's all fraud, like everything else. And let's be clear: the United States is in a depression, and it will become very clear when the next leg drops. And another thing about that confuses people about whether we're in a depression now is this meteoric rise in the stock market, which seems like it's going to continue. And this is not unusual either, because if you study the history of the last depression, we had similar forces in play, and people have to remember that. A lot of the big banks profited and didn't go out of business during the last depression. A lot of money was made, and we have this dynamic playing out now much the same way. So there we have it. We're in a depression, but don't get depressed about it. I'm a useful idiot. Don't you be one too.